Welcome to Uninvited, the show where we cover news that matters to Ontario women. On this program, we're talking about Ontario's broken long-term care system and how to reimagine the sector for the better for both residents and workers now and in the future. But first, here are some recent headlines. The Ontario Hospital Association recommended a province-wide vaccine mandate for all healthcare workers after being asked for input by Premier Ford. But Premier Ford went on to ignore the OHA's suggestions, claiming it could result in tens of thousands of healthcare workers leaving. Although Ontario Health Minister Christine Elliott claims the provincial government did a risk assessment, they failed to provide the data to support this decision and those numbers, with critics arguing that COVID-19 outbreaks causing staff shortages is far worse than planned shortages caused by removing the few unvaccinated workers. Doris Grinspan, who's the head of the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario, called this decision by Ford a disgrace and shows a lack of courage to do what's right for Ontario's patients and workers. To not act immediately and go against the evidence is irresponsible. And instead of leadership at the government level, what we've seen is individual hospitals stepping up to put in place their own mandates as COVID cases rise again across the province. And with those cases continuing to grow and children under the age of 12 still ineligible to receive the COVID vaccine, they now account for the largest number of new daily infections. Despite this alarming rise in cases, the Ministry of Education has been slow to put in place rapid testing of students. But following public pressure, the Education Minister did finally agree to supply take-home tests starting in mid-November, and that has also been slow to roll out. Kids across Toronto will have a chance to roll up their sleeves and be a real superhero, according to Councillor Joe Cressy, who's the chair of Toronto's Public Health Board. Once Health Canada and Ontario health officials approved the Pfizer vaccine for young children, Team Toronto Kids is ready to quickly vaccinate 200,000 kids in a multi-pronged vaccination drive that includes superhero selfie stations where newly vaccinated kids can pose for photos, all in an effort to make the jabs more of a celebration. And based on federal government assurances, there will be a sufficient supply to vaccinate all kids rapidly, with a strategy that factors in below average income and lower teen vaccination rates. The approved shots will be given at sites, including schools, doctors' offices, community hubs, and city-run clinics. As the province expands eligibility, the locations will also provide third vaccine doses to people 12 and over. Canada's new Defence Minister, Anita Anand, announced her first significant decision since being sworn in earlier this year to have all sexual misconduct cases in the Canadian military handled by civilian authorities. This decision comes after the discovery of the sexual misconduct crisis within the military, with 11 leaders under investigation or being forced to retire as a result of their actions. Louise Arbour, former Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, is currently undertaking an independent investigation of sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, quoting that the allegations have led her to conclude that immediate remedial actions are necessary to start restoring trust in the Canadian Armed Forces. Although some say the efforts are positive, others believe this still fails to address the problem of culture and the barriers that victims face, especially women, to make a report in the first place. Alberta recently signed on to the federal childcare program. This is the latest in the Prime Minister's commitment to deliver $10 per day childcare in the next 5 years. 8 provinces have now signed on to this economic and social program. The lack of affordable, accessible childcare is a major obstacle to women re-entering the workforce. Childcare in Toronto can cost parents as much as $22,394 each year. The federal program could save parents almost $20,000 in childcare costs. At the time of this recording, the Premier has still refused to sign on to the deal for Ontario families. Instead, the Ford government has re-announced his commitment to the construction of Highway 413, a project the CBC reported would pave over farms, forests, wetlands, and 400 acres of the Greenbelt and cost taxpayers between $6 billion and $10 billion. Our program today will focus on one of the largest gaps in our Canadian universal healthcare system, long-term residential care. Long-term care homes, or LTCs, they've often been talked about in the Ontario media, but the COVID-19 pandemic has really magnified the failures of the system and the urgency of the current situation. A scathing report written in 2020 by the Canadian Armed Forces, who were called in to help long-term care homes during the pandemic, echoed many of Ontarians' worst fears about LTC conditions, with stories of patients suffering from dehydration and malnutrition, deplorable conditions, and severe lack of hygiene, with some families reporting they didn't even know their loved ones were sick before they died because they never received updates from nursing home operators. And with over 4,000 long-term care resident deaths during this pandemic, something needs to change, and it needs to change now. The biggest culprit of the crisis appears to be for-profit homes. For-profit homes are responsible for twice as many COVID-19 infections than non-profit homes and 78% more deaths. The province is currently prepared to dole out 30-year-long contracts to the worst-performing for-profit operators. Vivian Stamatopoulos, who's a professor at Ontario Tech University, studies family caregiving, and she said government's continued support of for-profit homes is terrifying during this watershed moment. Today, we'll be joined by Patricia Armstrong. She's a distinguished research professor in sociology and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. For more than 3 decades, she has produced exceptional books and articles on the Canadian healthcare system, shining a light on systemic weak spots. Her work focuses on the fields of social policy, women, work, health, and social services, and it makes the relationship between paid and unpaid work central to this analysis. Her recent report, Reimagining Long-term Residential Care in the COVID-19 Crisis, draws on lessons from the pandemic to uncover what we can do now and what we should plan for in the future. Pat, welcome to Uninvited. Thank you for being here. I wonder if we could start just by you telling us a bit about yourself and some of the work you've been doing.
I started out looking at women and work, which is what took me into healthcare, because healthcare is women's work. And that took me from hospital care to home care to long-term care, which is what I've been doing for the last 15 years or so.
The roles women take on are viewed a very specific way by the public. What is your work told you about the way people look at women's work today?
Well, especially when we look at home care and at long-term care, we think that the work is just something any woman can do. It's not skilled. It doesn't have a lot of value. It comes with having a vagina. You know how to do it. So it has low value. We pay low wages given the skill, effort, responsibility, and conditions that go with these jobs. And it's a hard struggle to get it recognized as skilled and valued work.
How does undervaluing women's work, how does that affect what happens in the long-term care sector and in long-term care homes?
I think, in part, we're prepared to hand over the work to people who haven't had very much formal training. We hand it off in terms of care in the home to women who have no formal training. We think that you can look after a partner who has severe forms of dementia just because you know this person and because you're a woman. A lot of it has to do with the kinds of things we associate with the home and with being a woman, like changing diapers, like helping people eat, like helping people go to sleep, like dressing them, like giving them a bath. We think of those as just easy things to do. But really, I think that it would be very good for some of the decision makers to have to spend a day providing this kind of care to a range of people who have the kinds of complex needs that people have in long-term care. When you're trying to get someone with dementia to have a bath, it takes a lot of skill and effort. And I think that if we expose more people to trying to do this work, maybe they'd recognize how difficult it is.
For those of us who may not have that insight into what a long-term care home is like for workers, for residents, give us a sense.
Well, over and over again, you'll hear when people talk about long-term care that it's changed a lot in the last 30 years because we've gone from people who drove themselves into these places and kept their cars to people who don't get in until they have very complex needs. So you have a range of people who have the very complex needs, but also a great variety of needs. So you might be looking after someone first thing in the morning, or you're trying to rush them to get them dressed, and that gets them upset, and you might get violence from that person who's upset because they're being rushed. You're trying to give a bath to someone who, for example, may have survived the Holocaust and is terrified of what putting them in a shower might mean. There's a whole series of encounters during the day that are full of risk for the person giving care and risk for the person needing care. And all of that is further complicated by the fact that there are just not enough people to provide the care.
I guess successive governments have tried to address the issues within long-term care with limited success. How did we get to the point where long-term care is so broken?
Well, a lot of things contributed to it. We have made hospitals more and more narrowly focused on acute care. And we've been sending people out of those places quicker and sicker. We've closed rehab hospitals, we've closed chronic care hospitals. So all of those people, or at least the kinds of people who used to be in those homes, now have nowhere else to go but long-term care. So we've increased demand, and people are living longer with more complicated health issues. And we haven't increased the number of beds to respond to that need in anything like the numbers that are required to address the gap. We have waiting lists that can be 3 years, and we don't like to think about growing old. We want to forget about it. And we've treated long-term care as the last and worst option. And we see it as a kind of failure of the family to look after you, failure of you to look after yourself, failure of the healthcare system to fix you. So that's where failures go. And that really contributes to the neglect of this system. But also, we've made it more and more in the hands of the for-profit industry. So less money goes into care. And in long-term care, almost all of your money goes to paying for people to provide the care.
We've seen some research that for-profit long-term care homes have greater fatality rates when it came to the pandemic. They didn't manage things quite as well as not-for-profit homes. Should we have a system where for-profit care doesn't have a place here in long-term care?
I don't think it has a place in long-term care. I think it will take a while to get rid of them. In Ontario now, we have close to 60% of the homes owned by for-profit corporations. They have to make money. So where are you going to make the money in terms of long-term care? These are heavily publicly funded organizations. They're funded by two primary sources from the government, and all the homes get the same amount of money. And they are funded from fees paid for by the residents. So there are only a certain number of places where you can make money. And that means that you have to cut corners in ways that can reduce the quality of care that people receive. And we have argued that the conditions of work are the conditions of care, and the quality of care is about the quality of the work. So you have to pay attention to your labor force, you have to invest in your labor force, and you have to give them the time and space to do that. And that's less likely to be in the case in a for-profit place. But the pattern is, and it was a pattern that existed before COVID, of the quality of care not being as good in those homes. There are more transfers to the hospital. There are more bed ulcers, just to take two examples. And we know that the wages are lower, and we know that the number of staff is lower. So it's not surprising that you're more likely to get poorer care. And it's not surprising that we saw this being really exaggerated, or at least made very evident during COVID.
Can we talk a bit about the government role in all of in long-term care? And I mean, specifically, I'm thinking about a time during the pandemic when the premier and the health minister said we're putting an iron ring around long-term care homes. Did that happen?
Well, I'm not sure even what the iron ring was supposed to be. Part of the iron ring that was there in the first place was that they didn't transfer people to the hospitals from long-term care because they gave priority to hospitals. Certainly, they stopped families from going into long-term care. And now there's a lot of rethinking going on about whether that was a smart thing to do. First of all, because families do a lot of the work of care. They have long done things like the laundry. They've long brought in food and taking people for a walk and chatting to them and providing this sort of all of those extras and cares. But a lot of family members were doing things like brushing teeth and washing hair and doing a lot of really direct care jobs. And that became really obvious when family members were excluded from being in long-term care. It was a very sad outcome for many people isolated in the homes. But also, family members are advocates for residents, and they keep an eye. They're a kind of accountability process. So all of that fell apart. And if that was part of the iron ring, then that was too bad.
We've heard some really terrible stories coming out of long-term care homes. Residents left in diapers for days, not getting fed, being dehydrated. Are these happening more? Do people only hear about this when it becomes an issue like the pandemic? Does this happen on a regular basis from your experience, from what you've heard from residents and from staff?
We did research a number of years ago where we interviewed care workers in long-term care who said they were only allowed a certain number of diapers per resident per day. And we wrote a paper we called the thin blue line because the diapers have a thin blue line on them. And the blue line is supposed to indicate when the saturation point has been reached. Well, if you're an adult and you're sitting in this all day until waiting for this blue line to change color, it can be very uncomfortable and it can be even dangerous. But it also completely undermines the skill of the person providing the care to decide this person needs a change, or denies the right of the residents to say, I want my diaper changed, right? But we are also putting more people in diapers because we don't have enough people to help them get to the toilet. So it's a complicated set of issues that combine to make the appearance of neglect.
I've heard you say this a few times. The conditions of work are the conditions of care. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Well, I'm delighted to say that the Prime Minister even used the phrase, so maybe we're getting through. Basically, what it means that if staff doesn't have the kinds of conditions they need, that certainly wages and sick leave and appropriate hours of care and continuity in their schedule so that they can look after the same resident on a regular basis. I mean, think of when a resident dies. If you've been looking after someone for more than a year, you've gotten to know them and their family, there's a lot of grief. And you need to be able to have the space and the time to get away from them. This is the area with the highest rates of absences due to illness and injury, long-term care. It's riskier being a long-term care worker than being a cop.
Wow.
We have people work in long-term care showing us bites all up and down their arms. They tell us about their broken arms. They get hit, they get punched, they get grabbed. And a lot of that actually has to do with the fact that there's just not enough time to provide the care that they need. All of those things are about conditions of work. And we need to really attend to those. If we want to do the resident-focused care that we hear about a lot, we can't do that unless we create the conditions for the staff to be able to provide that kind of care.
I was actually kind of surprised to read that the majority of long-term care residents are women, and they're being taken care of by women.
Women caring for women, and a really significant number of those who provide the care are newcomers to Canada or racialized. These are people often who have fewer other options because they're new to Canada or their credentials may not be recognized. And 90% of the people who provide the care in long-term care are women. And also women are poorer in old age. So they can't afford to pay a 24-hour nurse at home or provide some alternative, really expensive care.
You recently co-authored a report, Reimagining Long-term Residential Care in the COVID-19 Crisis. What is the role that government needs to play to make sure that we reimagine long-term residential care in a positive way?
Well, I think we have to start seeing long-term care as a positive option. We have to start listening to the hundreds of reports that have been done that say at the core, it's staffing, 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 and that is related to the working conditions. We've got to start there, but we can't end there. We have to think about the physical structures of long-term care homes. We've been building them like hospitals rather than like places to live. The average length of time they live there is 18 months, so we need to make them places where you can have some joy. We're making it more and more into a place that is about medical care and focusing on survival. Well, I'm not sure that I want to survive. I want to live, and even if that means taking some risks, like letting me go outside by myself, if it adds some joy to do those kinds of things, we need to take those risks.
Is this a funding issue? Is it a matter of putting more money or more dollars into the system?
Well, we certainly need more money, but we shouldn't just give it away. We should do it in ways that can really make a difference. We certainly need more money for staffing. We need more regular training for staffing. We need those kinds of supports. We need money for food. The food budget is just startling. If you have to feed people on the kind of pittance we allow for food, then it's hard to bring joy in your food. So yeah, we need more money, but we need it targeted and used creatively to it really improve what life is like and what work is like in these places.
We heard during the pandemic there were personal support workers who had a very tough time. Some of them, for example, would work in long-term care homes during the day and have to be in a homeless shelter at night. What are the conditions that would lead to something like this happening, and how do we fix that?
Well, in part, it's because there aren't enough full-time jobs. They don't offer people full-time jobs, so they don't have to commit to them in other ways. In Ontario, less than half of the people who work in long-term care have full-time jobs. So that means that they're working in more than one place. They're not getting a living wage, especially if they don't have full-time work. Given the housing prices and all of the other expenses, they have to get to and from work often. They have to travel a long way to get there. And the conditions in terms of working, given their high absences due to illness and injury, if they happen to be in a place where they don't get sick leave, that really adds to that whole issue again. And because you're a woman, you're often going home to do a second job, the same job again at home. If we could do it during COVID, saying you have to work in one place and give them full-time jobs, then we should be doing it all the time. We have interviewed so many long-term care workers who talk about how when they go home, they have to lie down and put their feet up because their legs ache so much. The kind of stress level they feel is enormous. Can you imagine what those workers felt like going home when they said, someone hasn't eaten today, someone hasn't had their bed changed today? Imagine how you feel. I mean, I can't believe that any of them are doing this on purpose. What's amazing is not how many left, but how many stayed under these kinds of conditions. And they do it because they like the work in the sense of they like looking after people. But of course, that makes it even worse when you can't do it.
The government has promised increasing the number of hours of care to 4 hours of care by 2025. Why should we have to wait until 2025?
We should have done it 10 years ago when that 4 hours was established as the minimum. And let's remember, this is a minimum. And of course, now every individual who lives in long-term care has more complex needs and so takes more care time. So of course we should be doing 4 hours right now.
I think this is something everyone will have to deal with eventually, but maybe when you're of a certain age, you're not thinking ahead that your parents might need long-term care, you might need long-term care. If we're thinking ahead to that, Should people feel good about putting their family members or themselves in long-term care homes right now?
I think they should be a little worried, but prepared to do it and prepared to advocate. In Sweden and in Norway, families see this as a positive move. They see this as a good thing. And the staff say, yeah, it's our job to provide the kind of care that you want your mother to have or your father to have. And whereas in Canada, we feel guilty. We feel, people say, I had to put my mother in long-term care, not, oh, my mother's in long-term care. That's what we need to change. It makes a difference if you actually change your whole notion of what is there. But it also requires government to put some money and some appropriate regulations.
Pat, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, and thank you for the interest in this issue, because it's an issue for all of us.
Definitely is. And you've been watching Uninvited. This is Working Ontario Women News. It's time where we turn things over to you for a segment that we call I'm Speaking. You can record a 60-second message at actwow.ca. Tell us what you're thinking, what's on your mind, your frustrations, your concerns, and we'll air it on our program. Thanks for watching Uninvited. Now, I'm speaking.
I'm speaking.
I have to
I'm
weigh
speaking.
in.
I'm speaking.
I have to
I'm
weigh
speaking. If you don't mind letting me finish.
Wait.
I'm speaking.
I'm a PSW. However, I would like the government of Ontario and the government of Canada in general to look at the state of the long-term care, because the way the long-term care is being run before this pandemic is nothing to write home about. Thanks to pandemic that has brought a little change to the long-term care in terms of staffing. Still, we are short of staff. So many times we're short of staff. We work endlessly. We're short on the floor. So many people calling sick. It's not their fault that they're calling sick, but because they work tirelessly. So our body, the nature will fight. If you don't give your body break, then the body will request for it. So I will employ the government of Ontario, the Ontario government, to help us in staffing area, so that there can be less burden on we PSW. So that's all I have to say. Staffing about in long-term care and make $3 pandemic pay a permanent. Thank you. God bless you.
I'm speaking. Burnout. Burnout has been so real throughout this pandemic. We all work day in and day out tirelessly to protect everybody and protect our own loved ones. Everyone is burning out. We are all short-staffed across the board. When these people call in sick, it falls down on the other staff and it becomes a vicious circle of burnout. It's real, and the mental burnout behind it is very real. We fight so many battles in our head about whether we're going to bring this virus home, whether we're even going to make it a year from now without getting sick, whether we're going to potentially pass it on to our patients or anyone else. The mental game that this plays is real. The stress that we bear is very real. This is an exhausting time for all of us, and people need to be kind. We are always here to help.